Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Radhika. I'm going to be having the pleasure of moderating this wonderful panel this morning. So I'd like to call upon the panelists for this session. Can I call upon Daiana from Philanthropy's lead for Microsoft Asia, Libby Bernick, who's the Managing Director and the Global Head for Corporate Business TrueCoast, Haoliang, the Regional Director, Asia Pacific for UNDP, Mr. Todd Gimbel, the Vice President, Government Affairs, Asia Pacific Herbalife, and Niall O'Connor, Center Director for the Stockholm Environment Institute.
This is a government minister, you can't really.
Great. So I want to perhaps start this panel before I pass the baton on to this esteemed panel of speakers to really looking at three critical issues that I thought were emerging from our discussions yesterday. And I think there have been a couple of sort of common themes that we heard. And I just want to touch upon those three themes and then hand it over to each one of you to perhaps give us a perspective on some of these issues. So I think not just in the opening, but along the different work streams yesterday and very much today, we've heard the sense of urgency that's required on the development agenda. So the time to act is now, is very clear. The second point is that perhaps there is absolutely no complacency. There's no room for complacency anymore. So there is no option for inaction, so to speak. And the third one being that the development agenda and the SDGs, so to speak, is everyone's agenda. So it gives us an opportunity to really look at collaboration and partnerships in a way that we've never been able to look at before. The ability to really form a new paradigm for partnerships. So that's pretty much what I'm going to put up the challenge to our panelists today to unpack this particular issue or a defining element of the SDGs, which is collaborative approaches and how we work together. We have a very diverse panel from looking at a philanthropy arm that sits within a tech giant to the largest international development organization sitting here, a leading organization working on risk assessments and ESG standards, to a global nutrition company, and finally, a leading think tank working on environment issues that you heard from yesterday. So what I'd love to do is, we're going to be working against time a little bit. So what I'd love is perhaps we could start with Haoliang on that end to give us an organizational perspective on perhaps a roadblock or a challenge that you see when it comes to collaborating around the SDGs, and what's a key essential ingredient to flipping that over and making things work from your perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Radhika. I think at macro level, I think the biggest challenge, to partnership approach to achieving the SDGs is that, we don't realize achieving SDG really takes everybody's effort to work together at society level. Or, even if we realize that it takes a societal effort but not acting on it, I think that, to me, is the biggest challenge. Right? And it's like the climate change. You see it's coming, but the world is not doing enough. Right? So I think this is the biggest challenge at macro level. At micro level, the obstacle to a partnership approach to achieving SDG, I think, is that we still tend to working in silos, right? Not realizing that it is cross-sectoral collaboration that is absolutely required. Now, to turn this around, I think clearly you need to have leadership, right leadership. Right? And secondly, you need to connect the dots. I think these are the two things that I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you change your microphone because we're not able to hear very well?
Okay. I spoke quite loud, right?
Daiana, why don't we continue with you while we get that fixed?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Daiana Beitler, and I lead Microsoft Philanthropy.
That's my problem. Not your problem.
Hello?
Okay.
This works. Right, old-fashioned way. My name is Daiana Beitler, and I lead Microsoft Philanthropies across Asia. So I think there are three things that could be seen as challenges, but I would like to see them more as opportunities. The first one is that when we enter into partnerships, all of the different organizations that we often work with have different sets of priorities, and actually different programs that are already underway. So the first opportunity we have is to try to bring these different programs that different organizations, Microsoft on one side, government, multinational organizations or multilaterals, and other corporates. We all have different programs or initiatives or priorities that need to come together. So that's one of the first kind of big opportunities. The second one is that each of us have a set of assets within our companies that we can leverage to bring to this collaboration. When I think about Microsoft as a company, of course we have community investments that we make every year, but we also have our technology, state-of-the-art technology, everything from our productivity suite that you're all familiar with, all the way to artificial intelligence, machine learning. And so identifying what assets each of the players has that could bring to this table, beyond the usual thing, beyond the cash, beyond the in-kind contributions that we have, identifying what those assets are and how they can bring value to the table, I think, is another big opportunity. And then the third one is sustainability and scalability. Usually when these projects have a set timeline, people tend to think of them as a 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year investment. But when so many people come to the table in long-term partnerships, there's an opportunity for thinking and going even bigger. So to give you an example of how some of these things come to life, our flagship program at Microsoft is to provide digital skills training and computer science training to underserved communities so they can be part of the digital economy. So we often partner with nonprofits that are providing this skills training to underserved communities. And we bring government in because governments actually provide a whole lot of expertise, of course, on the subject matter, but can also help us scale and ensure sustainability beyond our project. So we basically pilot what we want to do or what we think would be a best practice example of a digital skills education program, and the government then takes it on and rolls it out nationally. So that's just an example of how we've been able to bring some of these partnerships to life.
Very good. Hello, everyone. My name is Libby Bernick. I'm with S&P Global. And from our perspective, one of the great challenges in getting these SDG collaborations is to find ways to connect investors and companies within the private sector. And what we really need to do is to go from activities that are ad hoc and one-off to those that are very intentional and scalable. And from our point of view, what's really vital and important is to have data and transparency to make those kind of decisions at scale across global economies. So for S&P Global, we are one of the world's leading providers of data, ratings, analytics, and benchmarks to the financial services industry, to both the capital markets and the commodity markets. And within S&P Global, the Trucost ESG business that I manage is working to make this data available at scale to the markets. So again, our interest and our challenge as well is to really provide more transparency and data on SDGs to mainstream investors and mainstream corporations in a way that capital allocation decisions can be made with confidence.
Todd.
Good morning. I'm Todd Gimbel with Herbalife Nutrition. And for those of you who don't know us, we're one of the largest nutrition products companies in the world. We're in business in over 90 countries. And we kind of backed into partnerships, into the goals, because our business model is very unique, and it turns out that our business model is very open to working in collaborations and getting access to a lot of people who have the desire to live healthier, more active lifestyles. Once we realized that we had this model, we started to become more engaged and look at the idea of partnerships. The challenge is with the private sector is that before we can enter a partnership with a government or an NGO, we have to get over the hurdle of risk of reputation and of trust. I think that there has been movement over the years where the private and public and government sectors have come closer together in working, but the private sector always has to overcome a hurdle of, do we trust these folks to do what we tell them to do, or do they have an ulterior motive of profit or of this or of that? What we've found is that just by persevering, by working with governments and other groups, by showing them what we can do, we have built that trust, and it's led to some successful partnerships. I'll just mention one. For many years, we have been very successful in Brazil. Our business model allows our member distributors to set up these nutrition clubs where it's basically like a social enterprise where our members set up a club and people come in on a daily or every other day basis to have some products, to learn about nutrition, to exercise and other things. For many years, the Ministry of Health in Brazil did not want to talk to us at all. Then they started to have a credibility issue right before the Zika crisis came about. And they reached out to us and said, hey, can we, through your clubs, disseminate information on Zika because you have access to hundreds of thousands of people? And it was the start of a great relationship. And we've been able to take that relationship and bring it in closer to our mission of health and nutrition, and I'll be able to talk a little later about some of those other partnerships.
Thank you. Niall.
Okay, good morning. My name is Niall O'Connor with the Stockholm Environment Institute. I think the biggest kind of challenge here is the complexity of the SDGs. We know that there's 17 kind of goals, but there's another 169 sub-targets that we're trying to achieve. And trying to bring the various kind of components in society, the civil society, the government, the private sector together to try and build a program towards that is quite complex. Everybody has their own kind of priorities when they start off in the process. They don't necessarily understand the interlinkages between the various goals, and they're not working in a kind of coherent way together to try and address these. So I think I was mentioned earlier, this siloed mentality, we've got to make sure we break those barriers and get people working together. And if we can do that, I think we end up with a priority set of targets. We end up with kind of more efficiency in how we're going to approach each of these, working together. And this in itself can try and encourage more collaboration, more partnerships. I think one of the ways to kind of, the essential ingredient, as you meant, is to simplify the process. We can't work with so many targets all the time. We have to narrow it down. And maybe we can narrow it down to a national context, or we can bring it down to a sectoral context, and then try and work within that to define the types of priorities you have. And within SEI, we've developed a tool that will help kind of, from the different stakeholders' perspectives, looks at the goals that you're working with and see what are the positives and what are the negatives in terms of each individual stakeholder. So we developed kind of a 7-point scale where you can look at the interactions, positive or negative, from different stakeholders' perspectives, and then come up with a priority list of actions that you want to take forward. If we can try and do that, I think then we begin to get the policy actors, we begin to get the stakeholders together to have a common agreed approach and common priorities to take forward to enable us to overcome the complexity that we're facing. So it really is about simplifying and then working on a set priority together.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to say that the app that we were introduced to yesterday is being used, so I see a couple of questions coming in. Given the time that we have, I'm going to try and weave it into the questions through the panel as we move forward. So thank you for sharing those perspectives. I think, a couple of common threads again, I think in how we turn, I like how Daiana put it in terms of, really looking at these challenges as opportunities. And then also, how do we connect the dots? How do we focus and prioritize on a very complex agenda? And how do we really find common ground? And speaking of common ground, I want to pick up on a point that I think Malcolm, every time we move into networking sessions, says, go and have unusual conversations. Try and talk to somebody you wouldn't otherwise normally talk to. And so I'd love to ask our panel to perhaps share an experience or an approach that has worked in forming an unusual alliance or an unusual partnership, because the SDGs is clearly a unique platform that allows us to move outside the boundaries of, typically partnerships that usually used to emerge into sort of looking at a diverse range of partnerships. So maybe I'll start off from this side this time and ask Niall to kick us off.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll give two brief examples on that. I think using the SDG interaction tool that we've developed, we've been able to work with a number of governments, the Swedish government, the Mongolia government, and with Sri Lanka, to be able to bring together all the key stakeholders in government to assess kind of the SDGs and the priorities at each of the various ministries we're going to address. I think it was a unique way of bringing all of the different government departments together and making them see that they don't know, well, where they traditionally work in silos, by working together they can actually see different objectives, see where they work better together, see how they can be more efficient with the resources government have to invest in SDG programs. So I think for us it was very interesting to see how you get so many different mindsets, so many different sets of priorities, some of which seem to be competing with each other. Maybe the Ministry of Mining wants to get more land from forestry and so forth. So how to get them to come together and work together was kind of one of those unique partnerships that this tool allowed us to develop. And the second one that we're now in the process of developing is with the Swedish Steel Producers Association. So we've done it with government level, now we want to look at sector level. And they have great ambitions to try and become carbon neutral by 2030 and into 2050. They want to be carbon zero. So they're now working with us to develop a tool for the industry to look at the SDGs, how they interact with the industry, how they interact with the private sector, how they interact with government, to kind of help prioritize their approach to supporting SDGs. So we're trying to see how these tools become more effective for the private sector and how they can then link to the bigger picture and make sure they embed themselves into the whole SDG arena at national level as well. So they're two key examples of driving through tools and through kind of collaborative approaches, how each of these are taking ownership of the program, and how we're then, from an SEI perspective, also making sure we're putting in kind of a just transition approach and a gender and social equality approach into the program. So I think tools and support and ownership is making it work.
Great, thank you. Todd, I think you mentioned the example of the Brazil government as well, and I think one of the questions that was coming in through the app now was also about looking at public-private partnerships in particular. So it'd be great if you could actually touch upon an example or elaborate on what you picked up on at the beginning.
Sure. So for us, our natural partners would be ministries of health or programs within countries where the government is looking to make people healthier and give them advice and also get analytics back from them so they understand the demographics of and some of the statistics on whether these people have a propensity to become obese or to get non-communicable diseases. So we reach out to a lot of ministries of health. An excellent example of that is in Indonesia, we have a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Health and their Germas program, which is a healthy, active lifestyle program. And the beauty of that is that we are not the experts, we're not doctors, we're not giving health advice. We certainly give nutrition advice, but we've taken the materials that they produce and we've merged together to be able to spread that out to a much larger audience. So for example, in these nutrition clubs in Indonesia, of which we have thousands, we are putting the Germas materials in the clubs and we invite people in from the government to talk to our members. On the flip side of that, we sponsor like the Bali International Triathlon, which is a huge event. And at that event, we give the Germas and Ministry of Health people some space to set up a booth to talk to people. So the success of these things is because you build the trust, you get together, and you each focus on the things that you are good at, and that's what can help blossom the partnerships.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, one of the examples that I'll share is some work that S&P Global has done over the past year. About 2 years ago, I started traveling around to our regional markets and met with a number of companies and investors, quite a few companies and investors actually, and came away and heard two things. The first was that companies were having challenges understanding how to move from mapping business activities against the SDGs and towards action. And the second thing I heard was that investors were very excited that companies were mapping their business activities to the SDGs, but what they needed was quantitative data to actually make decisions about how to allocate capital, for example, in an equity portfolio. And so S&P Global built a quantitative SDG model of the economy, and we brought together over 12 companies representing a variety of industry sectors to run that SDG evaluation tool. And we also created an investor advisory group to walk alongside us. And it was that combination of diverse perspectives, multi-sector companies, and then investors, large, small, mainstream, and socially responsible, coming together to try and understand how data can better inform these decisions. And like your assessment, we also found that focus was very important. Of those 169 SDG metrics, we found that about 46 are actually relevant and we think measurable by the private sector. And our results will be launched November 5th in London. But just to give you a taste, we also have created an SDG investor heat map, which came out of that collaboration that we think will be very valuable, again, in bringing these kind of collaborations to scale.
Great, thank you. Daiana, before you jump in, I have a question that's very specifically to you from the audience as well, so maybe you could speak to that if possible. When you're talking about partnerships, in particular, if you could focus on how your company is looking at partnering with non-tech companies and non-tech sector and bringing them along as you move forward on the agenda.
Sure, happy to talk to that. We are a tools-making company, so technology is just a tool, meaning there are no unusual partnerships because anyone and everyone can benefit from using technology as a tool, and we know that technology can maximize everyone and anyone's impact. Just to give you an example of how we partner with non-tech companies for our work, we recently announced a $200 million investment on bringing artificial intelligence to solve 3 fundamental societal challenges of our time. The first one is environmental sustainability, including climate change. The second one is benefiting the 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. And the third is humanitarian crises, particularly the refugees crises. So very much aligned with the SDG agenda. This huge investment that we're making, we're calling it AI for Good, basically brings the tools of artificial intelligence into the hands of any organization working on trying to solve these 3 different challenges. We provide the technology, we of course invest in the development of the solution, and we bring Microsoft expertise from the Microsoft research team to help them develop, artificial intelligence type of solutions or tools. Just to give you an example of, how wide the range of partners we have for that particular program is, one of my favorite ones is a partnership with a project called the Elephant Listening Project. And I have 4-year-old twins, so I spend a very significant amount of time watching elephants. So this one, I could actually talk to my family about. Basically, there's a set of researchers here in Asia that are working to save elephants and stop illegal ivory trade and poaching. So they've put acoustic sensors all across really noisy jungles to try to distinguish between the calling of elephants and all the other noises within a jungle. Insects, human voices, gunshots. But recognizing the patterns in the calling of elephants is an incredibly hard thing to do because, of course, jungles are very noisy. But it's the perfect job for artificial intelligence because they can basically, in a really quickly way, distinguish the patterns between the different sounds. And with that information, the researchers are able to send signals to the field to stop poaching. So there are no unusual partnerships for a tool-making company like we are. And if anyone in this room is interested in exploring these partnerships, our door is always open. Thank you.
Thank you. Haoliang from UNDP side.
Yeah, I think now you can hear me, I hope. Okay. 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, working with the private sector for the UN is unusual, was unusual. Okay. Because I think with the changing world, and with the changing official development assistance landscape, so there was a tendency early on for the UN agencies to look at the private sector as a source of funding to replace those lost funding, so to speak, right? So I think so during that period of time, I think the partnership was not very successful, I would say. Right? But I think today, we realized that. I think the converging point is working together to achieve results for development. So I think the unusual partnership of the past has become very usual nowadays. Right? So we have so many examples of successful partnership at scale with companies in different countries. I see my colleagues from India here, and many countries. In India, for example, we have significant partnership, with IKEA, for example, right, to provide vocational and skills development support and job, opportunity support to over 1 million women in India, right? So this is a very important initiative, right? And I think, I don't know if it was featured in the last couple of days, we also have, again, an important partnership with Coca-Cola in India for plastics recycling. Right? That has a potential to be scaled up to other industries. Right? So I think, what was unusual is now, I think, a very common. Right? And what's important for us is really, to look at what results we want to achieve. And in that, I think there's so many other examples that I can give.
We are also partnering with Microsoft in India as well.
So it's excellent, right? So this is really good. And again, speaking of India, right, it's talking about unusual partnerships. In India, over the last 2-3 years, we worked, UNDP, right, worked with the Indian government together and some other UN partners, and works Indian private companies to have developed a cloud-based logistics management system for vaccines in India. Right? So now the entire stock of vaccine in India, will be covered by this system, right? With a $40 million contribution from Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance. Right? We didn't have the kind of funding to support it, right? But we did it in a partnership approach with Indian software capacity, Indian hardware capacity, right? And so to have developed a system now is already covering more than half of the country. So with an app, like this, right, a cell phone, you can access the network and know the type, the quantity, and the temperature of vaccines in any cold chain refrigerator in the healthcare system. Right? So this would not have been possible with just our usual approach. Right?
Great. That's a great testament to stepping outside and looking at partnerships from a different perspective. But I also take Daiana's point of view that there are, for a company like yours, there are no unusual partnerships. And I love the example of the project that you just described with elephants and the fact that you can have that conversation with your kids at home as well. So there's a couple of questions coming in from the audience as well, so please keep it coming. I'm going to just leave this as an open question. I know trust was mentioned a few times at the beginning in the opening. So if anyone would like to talk a little bit on that specific topic when it comes to building that trust and building that relationship across different sectors and different industries, I'll just leave it open if anyone wants to take, Todd, please. Sure.
I think I mentioned it. Look, I think trust is probably the most important starter for a successful partnership. And as you mentioned, years ago, UNDP wouldn't partner with private sector, and now you are partnering with many private sector members. And I'm sure that you select those private sector members by getting to a point where you trust that they bring something to the table and that they're in it for the greater good of what you're trying to achieve. And I think for the private sector, it takes us a while to get there, some longer than others. And what we try to do is always build that trust by being honest, by being ethical, by dealing with stakeholders as much as we can and letting them know who we are. And then at the end of the day, a company like mine brings something really valuable to the table of partnerships, and our future partners and our current partners get to that point where they trust that we're doing it for the right reasons, and then they start to work with us, and that's how it blossoms, and it brings on more partnerships. I mean, Microsoft probably had to start early on with little partnerships, and now you've got some gigantic ones. We're more still in the early days, but we look for partners, and we make sure that by the time we start a project, they know that we're in it for the right reasons, and then that makes for a more successful project.
If I can add a point on this issue of trust, for the UN to be, have partnerships with the private sector, there's always a question of reputational risk. That's on our mind, right? It's a big deal, right? And because private sector is known to have a profit motive, right? So for us to be involved with private sector, always an issue in the UN, right? So we have a set of systems to do due diligence and so forth, right? Now, I would say, let's say, working with Microsoft is probably easier to approve, right? Relatively speaking, it's always, right? I see colleagues from SAP here, we're also talking to them about collaboration, right? working with Coca-Cola, is a challenge, right? Because of the reputation risks associated with obesity and so forth, right? Yeah, but in this case of plastic recycling, it took us half a year in our system to discuss whether we should approve these partnerships or not. Right? It took half a year for this discussion to reach my table. It took me 1 minute to say we should do it. Because I think it is a question of trust, and based on shared vision, right, shared objective. So I think if we establish that, have a common objective, I think we can do it.
I want to add a point on trust. Trust is perhaps the hardest conversation that the technology sector is having at the moment. Of course, there's an angle about that us as a private sector trusting nonprofits and other types of organizations, but they need to trust us too. And more importantly, they need to trust the tools that we make. And it's incredibly hard because the kind of tools that we're producing at the moment, things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, are things that most people don't understand. So how do you trust something that you don't understand? We actually learned that we needed to build trust the hard way. Just to give you an example, one of the facial recognition systems that we had put to the market that actually was being developed for a really good goal was fundamentally biased. And it detected light-skinned men with error rates of 1%, with error rates of 12% for darker-skinned men and 35% for women. And we did not like that one bit. And we didn't like it because it was not good for business. But more importantly, it wasn't good for building trust with our customers, with our partners, with everyone we want to work with. And so we learned that we had to build trust as well as a company. We put together a framework for ethical development of technology and artificial intelligence with 6 different principles. Transparency, because whatever we produce as technology needs to be fully transparent, and people that are affected by these technologies need to understand how these systems operate. We need to be accountable, so accountability is the second one. Us as a company need to be accountable for the solutions we develop. So if you partner with Microsoft and use our tools, we are accountable for what these tools are doing to the beneficiaries or the people we work with. Then fairness, of course, because the systems need to treat people in the same way. Safety and reliability, privacy, and of course inclusiveness. It needs to benefit everyone. So just to go a step further, in terms of building that trust, in addition to this ethical framework, we're also proposing that coders and engineers sign a Hippocratic oath, like doctors do, with this principle of doing no harm. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, the private sector does want to get to know the partners that we work with, nonprofits, multilaterals, governments, and build trust in them. But we as a sector itself, the technology sector particularly, need to do our job at building that trust towards you, our partners.
Thank you.
Just to add briefly, one of the difficulties we had, I suppose, working with governments in so many different departments is trying to build trust. You would assume there's trust across all the different government departments, but there generally isn't. And it takes quite a bit of time to develop that trust. And I think for us, it's having that long-term perspective of working with partners. It's not a short-term idea that you're trying to solve this problem this week, next week. You've got to look at 1, 2, 3, 5 years ahead of ourselves to build trust and to build that collaboration, which I think might be a problem with Microsoft, because the pace of change for technology is so fast that people can't keep on top of it. So it's a difficult challenge from a technological point of view. But when you're working with governments, it's about creating a long-term relationship and building trust over time. And that's difficult because people come and go so often at the government level as well. So it's a continuous turnover. But I think we have to focus on the long-term horizons.
And from our perspective, trust goes along with transparency. So when we're working with capital markets or commodity markets, it's hard to measure that individual trust that you've developed with a collaborator or with a government official. And so the way we try and demonstrate that trust is to provide transparent data, again, at scale on these SDG issues to the markets. So for us, trust and transparency goes hand in hand.
Great, thank you. Clearly, I mean, I thought that we had touched upon this issue, but it clearly strikes a chord across all the speakers, and I think it's such an important and defining piece of looking at collaborations and partnerships, because it's kind of the thing that makes it work or not, I guess, from a starting point. I'm cognizant of time that we have. What I'd like to do is maybe ask each one of you, put you up to the challenge, to talk about, in a word if possible, but otherwise in a sentence, to say what success looks like in a partnership for you. How do you define and measure that success? Any takers?
I will take it, but I will take more than one sentence.
That's fine. I can give you two, Haoliang.
Okay, fine. There may be more than two now, but another time of the floor. Okay, I'm kidding. So I think the key issue is that to have shared vision is not enough. Okay, I think that's a challenge. Okay, you need to have incentives. Right? For partners involved, there has to be incentives for everyone. Okay, and one example that we have, I'm working with youth leadership and youth entrepreneurship at regional level is a very good example. Everybody knows that the issue of youth employment is critical for social stability and for development, right? But for people to work together, you really need to look at incentives. Now, in this case, we have UN involved, we have governments involved, we have private sector involved, right? We have other ecosystem organizations involved. Everybody is benefiting from it. For example, this project is funded entirely by private sector. We have contributions from city foundation, right? We have contributions from a regional private bank in China. We're now talking to a few more partners on funding this regional initiative that is going to expand to 24 countries, right, to support the young people. Now, why do the banks fund it, right? Because the banks tell me very clearly that, of course, there's social benefit, but they also see these future entrepreneurs as their potential customers, right, for borrowing potentially, right? So I think it's really important to understand the incentives, interests of parties involved. Then can we really have a good initiative?
Success to us is if we can bring the benefits of technology to enable sustainable development across the region and enable economic opportunity for all.
Thank you.
And success from our perspective means that we're able to quantify financial return right alongside environmental and social return.
For us, it would be finding relationships that are based on trust and transparency, where we can put partnerships together where everyone understands their expertise, their roles and responsibilities, and you have clear goals, and together, in unison, you can reach those goals. And those things are hard to find, but that would be success.
Thank you.
Naturally, I would have said all those things if I had the time, but I just add to it, I suppose, the success for us, beyond the collaboration that we want to have, beyond the transparency that we want to have, and I think the critical urgency that we have to face it with, but being urgent without making mistakes, too many mistakes along the way, but to make sure that we integrate a just transition in this process. We have to make sure that we're bringing them full inclusivity of the various different societal groups that we're working with, and particularly in gender. We have to make sure that everybody is part of the solution, not just the select few.
Thank you. So I think we have a whole lot. I'm not going to try and summarize that. That was a really, really rich discussion, so I want to thank each one of the panelists. Just some food for thought, I think, thinking about how to create common ground and find common connectors that would unite us towards a common goal, I guess. Building trust, finding incentives, I think that's key to making partnerships work and take them off the ground, and really leveraging each other's strengths in terms of working towards common goals. So with that, I want to thank the panel for sharing their experience, their insights, and to all of you for putting the questions forward and making this an exciting panel. Thank you.